Hello and welcome to the Norfolk Chamber GDPR podcast, in which we're looking at how the new data laws are going to affect businesses in Norfolk and, crucially, what you should do to make sure your business complies with the new rules. Now, big changes are on the way this year as the rules come into force around how we store, use and manage data. The GDPR, or European General Data Protection Regulation, will come into force on May 25th. And those regulations affect any business holding personal data on customers or employees. So in this podcast, we're going to be looking at the types of data that will need protecting and how businesses can ensure their data is stored securely, and also breaches and how to guard against them. Now, joining me to discuss this are Darren Chapman from Cyberscale. Hello. And John Gostling from Breakwater IT.
Morning.
Thanks both for joining us. I suppose let's just start at the beginning. So Darren, starting with you, if I may. GDPR, what is it and how is it different from what we've currently got?
So it's really a kind of new version of the current data protection regulation that we have now, which was been put in place many years ago and is really no longer fit for purpose in terms of the way that data is stored and processed.
Why isn't it fit for purpose?
Just because things have moved on so much. When that regulation was put in place, there wasn't as much digital storage and processing of data as there was today, and it wasn't as transportable.
John, I'm just going to turn to you at this point then. What do you see as the significant difference then between these new rules and data protection as we currently understand it?
I think a lot of people will look at the key headlines here will be looking at the fines. So the fines are vastly greater than they are under the Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act, the largest fine they can give is £500,000. Whereas under the new laws, you could potentially have a 4% of your turnover or up to £20 million.
Wow.
So that could be quite big.
That's massive, isn't it? I mean, can businesses afford to pay that?
I don't know. I would probably not. I would probably think not. I think that would be very difficult for anyone to pay that kind of fine. Whether they will, the ICO will hit people with that fine straight away, I don't know. But I think it's there and it's got to be used, really. You know, when you look at some of the breaches that have happened and some of the actual monetary penalties, they're not actually that great. And it's easier sometimes, I suppose, for people to not protect their data and suffer a breach and pay the fine.
Darren, do you think? I mean, you work with a lot of kind of small businesses and micro businesses. Do you think the issue is that they just don't think that these rules will apply to them?
I think there is some of that. Yeah, I think it's becoming less so as GDPR gets more, more media coverage and awareness. But it's very similar to cybersecurity in general. There is a perception that I'm too small to have to worry about it. And sometimes, security is a big balance. So you do have to balance what you're going to do to keep yourself protected with the ability to run your business. And obviously with a small business particularly, there's a cost involved and you have to obviously balance that. You're doing that every day as a small business.
John, you talked about breaches. I mean, what actually constitutes a breach?
Do you want the official text?
Tell me as it is as you understand it.
So it's essentially, it could be down to the loss of anything, any personal data, and that's what the GDPR is about. It is personal data. It's not necessarily any of your other intellectual property. It is personal data relating to human beings. So if that data is modified in any way, if it's read by an authorised person, if it's deleted, if it's unavailable for some reason, a lot of the breaches you tend to find are people hacking into systems, copying data out, and using it for whatever purposes they deem fit.
And what sort of personal data do you mean there? I mean, I know people will think about cookies and tracking sort of data onto your website. Is that what you mean, or are you also talking about say the data that you hold on staff or employees, for example?
So any as the GDPR, personal data is about anything that can identify you as a human being. So your name, your email address, your date of birth, your driver license number, your address, your IP address in some circumstances now. Things like that. Anything that can identify you as a human is the data that people are after and that you need to protect.
That being the case then, Dan, I mean, what do people actually need to do then, both to ensure that they are compliant and to avoid making these kind of breaches?
Yeah, so I think John touched on it. Firstly, is understanding what protecting the data means, and we have a concept in cybersecurity that we use, which is very well referenced in GDPR as well, which is something called CIA, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. Okay. So those are the things that you're always trying to protect. The next thing that you need to do is really understand where your data is. So understand the data that you're keeping within the context of GDPR, and understand where it is, and that means all the copies of the data.
Yeah, and when you say where it is, do you mean because it may be stored on different servers, or you may have it on sort of a computer in one office, and is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of people will move their data to the cloud, for instance, nowadays, and that's where a lot of the personal data will be stored. One thing that organisations sometimes don't remember is that there will be multiple copies of that data. So it's not only the data that's on the data center, which may be in Amazon or Microsoft, but it's also synchronized copies of that data on people's devices. And they could be laptops, phones, tablets, and also could be on email as well. So if you're looking to protect that data, which is something that you need to do, you need to understand where it is.
But if you've got staff, say, staff are coming and going all the time. It's going to be a nightmare, isn't it, to ensure that that they don't leave and take that data with them. I mean, how do you control that?
I think you have to have a lot of policy and a lot of process in place. You have to know what data you've got in the first place. So, do you have data stored in an Excel spreadsheet? Do you have it? Are people allowed to synchronise that to their devices? Is it in a database? Is it encrypted? If someone has a laptop, do they encrypt that laptop when they go off-site? I think you have to have good training with staff, because I don't think you can ever 100% protect against a staff member copying something, stealing something, distributing it, or even just making a mistake. Yeah. So making sure that people understand what data you have and how they are, how they should be using that data, I think is really important.
And what about the data that you already have? I mean, is there something that you need to do now, with the existing data, because that you've already got, to make sure it's compliant, or are you okay just to transfer it across?
I think you need to make sure you understand what data you have now. You need to be identifying the data you have. You need to be risk assessing it. So you need to, like Darren said, understanding where it's stored, who has access to it, is it encrypted. What kind of data is it? Is it likely to cause harm to someone if there was a breach of that data? Yeah. How would it impact someone if it was stolen, or if it that got out into the open?
So does that mean that you have to get new permissions for the data that you've already got, or are you okay to assume that that everything's still in order?
So one of the things that from a legal perspective, when you start to look at GDPR, one of the really kind of critical factors is that you have to have a relevant lawful basis for processing personal data. So that's and there's a number of those, and if you're looking at existing data, you have to look at the basis that you're collecting it on, the reason that you have it, and depending on which of those bases that you're using, you might have to look at how that data was collected in the first place and how that was communicated to customers. So you do need to go through that assessment process.
And is there a time limit on this? I mean, is there an example where the data could expire, for example?
There's different regulations. So, I mean, there are some regulations which, in some cases, will override the need for GDPR. So, if you're collecting data for a marketing purpose, for instance, then there are sort of reasonable timeframes that you could perhaps keep that data for if you're not actively using it. But then there's other regulations that come into play where you have to keep data for a certain period of time. So if that's a law that you have to comply with for your business, then that would kind of override the GDPR requirements. But it's a little bit of a you obviously have to go through those assessments and understand all those different contexts.
On that note, it's essentially making sure the data you have is relevant. But actually, any business should be wanting to make sure the data you hold is relevant anyway. What's the point in having a CRM database full of rubbish? It's not going to be accurate. You're going to market to the wrong people. If you make sure you have either consent or a reason for processing that data, then the data's going to be accurate. So actually, it should be a business benefit to having accurate data in the first place.
And I guess we're talking about internally within the organisation, but externally, your customers, your clients, what rights do they have under this new legislation, maybe to access or look at some of the data that you've got, or actually know that you're fully compliant?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to turn around and say, "Are you fully compliant?" And I think it's difficult for someone to say, "Yes, I'm fully compliant," because there's no one actually saying, "Tick, yes, you are compliant." But you can still demonstrate accountability, and you can still demonstrate that you are looking after the data. They can ask you for access to the data you hold on them. They can ask you to erase the data that you hold on them if they no longer want you to hold that. I think that will be an interesting one. You can't actually charge for that anymore. You can charge for that for erasure and subject access requests under the Data Protection Act, but under the GDPR you can't charge for that.
John, you were also looking at some kind of quite high-profile cases around breaches. I just wondered if you could walk us through a couple of examples of where breaches have happened and the relevance of those, perhaps to businesses in Norfolk as well.
Yeah, so one back in January, Leicester City Council. This is human error, and this is, I think, one of the things we all need to concentrate more on. They sent an email out to 27 taxi firms in January, asking them to tender for helping them with services for children and people in care. They actually emailed out all the personal details for everyone that they needed assistance with, rather than just saying, "We need you to tender for this, and this." They actually put in people's names, people's addresses.
That's just a mistake, though, isn't it? I mean, that's an error.
But it's a huge mistake. And there's ways to mitigate that, like I said, training. Essentially, they wrote an email, they hit the attach button, and they attached an Excel spreadsheet. I would query why that data's live in an Excel spreadsheet that someone can just access and attach. There are systems that you can get, things like Office 365, if people are using that. You can turn on the security and compliance module, and you can mark documents as secure. So if it was marked as secure, it wouldn't actually be able to leave the organisation. So even if they did attach it, the system's going to say, "Hold on, that data can't be emailed out."
So under GDPR, then, does that mean that the council would get this 4% fine, or this this huge fine that we keep hearing about?
The fine won't go straight to the top of that level. I think, like any fine, that's the maximum they can give. They will look at it in a proportionate basis, and they'll look at the council and say, what processes? What processes do you have in place? What have you been doing to mitigate this? What cybersecurity measures have you got in place?
Darren, do you think? A lot of this sounds a bit scary, a bit complicated. Do you think businesses are actually ready for this?
Some are on the way. Some definitely aren't.
So what are they supposed to do?
So I think that the first step is really to just to drop. If you haven't done anything yet, make sure that you go to the ICO website.
Yeah. So what's the ICO?
So the ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office,
okay.
And they're the organisation, the government organisation that will be responsible for monitoring and enforcing GDPR in the UK, and they have some really good resource. They have something called 12 Steps to GDPR, and they've got some. It's quite well explained, it's quite simple. And they've got lots of. They've got some facilities where you can do a self-assessment, for instance, and there's lots of guidance on there. So that's the first thing to do, I think. And then the second thing to do is make sure that everything that you do is really, it's got to be based around your business. So it's really understanding the steps that you've got to take, and then basically putting a plan in place to address them, and being able to show that you're doing that and you're actually putting things in place. As John says, if there's an investigation on terms of a breach, that's probably what the ICO are going to do. They're going to look backwards and not necessarily say, what's the impact of this breach. They will look at the impact of the breach on the people whose data it is, but what they're going to do is, as in terms of your organisation, is look to see whether you've taken reasonable steps to try and protect that data. You never can protect it 100%, but as long as you're doing your due diligence and trying to protect that data and taking the right steps, then that's going to look favourably upon you.
And John, if as Darren says that there are businesses that aren't prepared for this even now, and we're talking about the rules coming into effect on May 25th, is it not a bit too late now? I mean, should these people be panicking, or do you think there is a way through that they can successfully negotiate?
I think the worst thing you could do would be to panic right now. Yes, you've got a deadline looming of when the GDPR comes in May on the 25th. But saying that is it's not like the millennium bug, which a lot of people have spoken about. It's got this big mass panic up until that point. It's not. It's an ongoing thing. You can't, and even now, if a business that's prepared for May, they can't then forget about it. They've got to keep doing it. They've got to keep reviewing. It's got to be an ongoing process. So I really don't think people should panic. I think they should start looking at it now. If you have a breach, but you can demonstrate to the ICO that you've been looking at it, that you've been risk assessing, that you've been doing your cyber security things and protecting your data, that you are trying to be accountable for it, they will look more favourably on you in that event of a breach.
And looking at what steps businesses can take, sort of practical measures. I mean, we talked a bit about policies and making sure that you're following the ICO sort of 12 steps as you described it, Darren. But on a practical level, then, would you recommend that businesses should take on their own sort of data protection officers or processing officers? I mean, we hear about that. Is that something that they should be looking at?
I think you've got to look at the size and scale of the business and the data they're processing.
Okay. If
you're a big business, then I think it's unavoidable. You have to have a DPO.
Yeah.
Whereas in a lot of small companies, even SMEs, 200, 300, 400 users, actually having someone as a DPO, I think is going to be challenging.
Yeah, there's some specific definitions in GDPR as to certain scenarios where you have to have a DPO.
Okay.
So those are quite well explained.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's nothing to say that if you don't fall within that category, you can't appoint a DPO to help you. But,
can you give us an example of those?
I'm not sure I can remember it off the top of my head, but it's really if you're doing. Some of it is so if you are a government organisation, for instance,
and schools as well. I think
schools fall into that category, and then also if you're doing, I can't remember the definition exactly, but it's if you're doing automated processing on a large scale of people's data, then there's criteria around that you would have to have a DPO as well.
I just want to sort of sum up a little bit here then in terms of you're both talking to Norfolk Chamber member businesses then. What do you see then as the biggest issues that they face and how confident are you that people have actually got their heads around this, Darren?
So I think one of the challenges is making sure that the senior people within the business have an understanding of the regulation and the importance of it, and you have buy-in at that level. If you don't have the support of your senior executive team in implementing these things, then it's always going to be an upward struggle. If you're sort of in the IT department or another department that's understanding these regulations, but you don't have that buy-in, it's going to be an upward struggle. Resourcing and skills is another. We see this in cybersecurity outside of GDPR as well. There's huge skill shortages in that area. I think a lot of it is sometimes there's a tendency to leave this to certain departments, the IT department being one of them. And there's a lot of focus on technical side of things, and sometimes the people and process elements of that get missed. In larger organisations, you'd have something called, in cybersecurity side, you'd have something called a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, who would be, sits between the technical and the senior executives and helps translate the business requirements into the IT security requirements and vice versa.
Okay.
Similar thing.
John, what about you? What's your sense?
I think Darren's definitely right, though. I think you need, in smaller businesses, you need 2 or 3 people, depending on the size of business, responsible for it. I don't think you can just leave it to one person to do. And like Darren says, the IT department tend to get, can you sort GDPR out? It's got a plug on it somehow. But that's not the case. Yeah. Everyone has to be responsible. Everyone in the business has to be responsible at some point. But you need teams of people to, and leaders, managers of their areas that need to be involved in managing it.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, that's a really good point to finish on. So we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. So thank you to my guests for joining us. That's Darren Chapman from Cyberscale.
Thank you.
And John Gostling from Breakwater IT.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to you two for listening. And if you'd like more information on this topic or other Norfolk Chamber events, then of course you can go to the Norfolk Chamber website. So thanks for listening.
This was a Tin Can Digital production for the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce, produced by Fiona Ryder and presented by Shaun Lowthorpe.